The man known to history as Oswald Mosley was born on the 16th of November 1896 on Hill Street in Mayfair, London. His father was Sir Oswald Mosley, the 5th Baronet Mosley. The baronetage had been introduced in Britain during the 17th century as a rank of minor nobility. The Mosleys represented a lower-ranking branch of the British aristocracy, possessing considerable financial independence. Their lineage could be traced all the way back to the 12th century in the initial stages of Norman rule in England. Sir Oswald served in the military for a period during Oswald Jr.'s youth, notably in Egypt, a British protectorate that had been effectively conquered in 1882 to secure Britain's stake in the Suez Canal and the sea route it provided to British India. Young Oswald's mother was Catherine Maud Edwards Heathcote, also a member of the British minor nobility with strong familial ties to the military. The family was additionally extremely wealthy, a near ancestor, Sir John Heathcote, having become a major business figure in Staffordshire in the late 18th century during the early phase of the Industrial Revolution. Oswald was the eldest of Catherine and Oswald Sr.'s 3 children. They had 2 younger sons, Edward and John Arthur, born in 1899 and 1901 respectively. Oswald's youth was, in some notable ways, a troubled one. While he clearly benefited from growing up as a member of a wealthy aristocratic family, his parents' marriage was not a happy one, and as the eldest of their 3 children, he was inevitably at the forefront of dealing with their marital difficulties. The conflicts between Oswald Sr. and Catherine typically revolved around his infidelity and overbearing nature, bordering on physical aggression. Eventually, Oswald's parents separated in all but name. Meanwhile, Oswald Jr., primarily known to family members in his youth as Tom to distinguish him from his father and grandfather, who were also named Oswald, was sent to live with his grandparents at Appledale Hall in Staffordshire, a large country estate. There he was, seemingly indulged by his grandparents for several years before being sent to Westdown's preparatory school, and subsequently to Winchester College, an elite institution originally established in the 14th century that served as a feeder college to Oxford University at a time when one social class dictated educational aspirations in Britain. At Winchester, Mosley excelled in several sports, participating in both boxing and fencing. His skill in the latter was noteworthy, and had he been born in a different era and to a different social background, he might well have ended up as a professional fencer. When he was just 16, Mosley left Winchester. Unlike others, he did not proceed to Oxford, but rather to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. In the 19th century, the sons of the British royal family had begun serving in the British Royal Navy and Armed Forces, and it soon became a well-established tradition for sons of the nobility to serve in the military or navy for some duration to advance the interests of Britain's vast empire. Following this tradition, Oswald arrived at Sandhurst in 1913. By that time, he had already acquired a reputation for having a contentious personality, frequently getting drunk and initiating fights while out and about Sandhurst. In the early summer of 1914, he was expelled from the military college for his behavior after he participated in a brawl that resulted in him fracturing his right ankle. Fortunately for Mosley, within weeks, Europe swiftly moved towards the First World War, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo in late June. Due to this, he was readmitted into the military and commissioned into the 16th the Queen's Lancers, a cavalry unit, as British forces prepared to head to France, where a significant portion of the most intense fighting would unfold on the Western Front over the next 4 years. Early in the war, both sides had recognized the potential of aerial warfare. The first aircraft had only been successfully flown in late 1903 by the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But immediately upon the outbreak of the conflict in late summer 1914, the British, French, Germans, and others realized the potential of aircraft, initially for flying reconnaissance missions, and subsequently as tools to break the military deadlock on the ground. Mosley quickly developed an interest in joining the nascent British Royal Flying Corps and began training as a pilot. His brief career in the Air Force proved disastrous. He rapidly completed his pilot's training. Then in May 1915, while showcasing his flying abilities in front of his mother at Shoreham, he crashed his plane. The impact shattered his right ankle, which had only recently recovered from the fracture sustained during the disturbance he was involved in at Sandhurst a year earlier. The double injury to his ankle aggravated the wound and reduced the likelihood of it healing completely. Then, to complicate matters further, he returned to France to fight in the trenches before it was fully healed. After re-aggravating the wound once more, he was informed that if he did not return to England to convalesce, there was a possibility of amputation. Mosley complied with doctor's orders when informed of this in 1916, but his ankle never fully recovered, and for the remainder of his life, he walked with a slight limp. Mosley saw active service at the Battle of Loos on the Western Front in France in the autumn of 1915, where he fainted from the pain in his leg. But his return to England early the following year effectively confined him to administrative duties at the Foreign Office and in the Ministry of Munitions for the rest of the First World War. Nevertheless, his eagerness to serve in France and the fact that it had left him with a permanent injury had earned him some respect in political and aristocratic circles. As the war neared its conclusion, he was consequently contacted by senior figures in the Conservative Party with a view towards contesting the 1918 general election. He was duly elected for the constituency of Harrow, where he secured an easy victory in an uncompetitive race. Thus, just weeks after turning 22, he entered the British Parliament as its youngest member. He began to make his presence felt there. Based on his oratorical skills, his delivery being significantly better than that of most other members of the House. He served as the representative for Harrow for the next 6 years, gaining re-election in 1922. A daughter and a son, Vivian and Nicholas, followed in the initial years of the marriage, and belatedly, a third child, Michael, was born after a long interval in 1932. Other than this superficial appearance of family stability, their marriage was a tumultuous one in which Oswald wreaked havoc among the Curzons. He engaged in an affair with Cynthia's younger sister, Alexandra, for a time, and also with Grace Curzon, Cynthia's stepmother, who had married Lord Curzon in 1917, his first wife, Cynthia's mother, having died many years earlier. Mosley was involved in other affairs as well, but these relationships with his wife's sister and stepmother were undeniably of an unusual level of moral dubiousness. Despite the peculiar nature of their marriage, Cynthia and Oswald shared many similar political views, and she appears to have influenced him substantially in the 1920s. She was a supporter of the labor movement and later in the 1920s even became an adherent of Leon Trotsky, the powerful member of the Soviet Union government who eventually fled from Russia after a power struggle with Joseph Stalin. Oswald, too, ended up drifting politically to the left in the 1920s. In 1922, he crossed the floor, a well-known euphemism for when a member of the British Parliament changed political parties to join a rival party. Historically, crossing the floor was associated with individuals moving between the Conservatives and the Liberals, the two dominant parties during the 19th century, but in the post-war period, Labour had surpassed the Liberals to become the main rivals of the Conservatives. Mosley's decision to cross the floor led to a temporary interruption in his political career. In October 1924, the first-ever Labour government, a minority administration led by Ramsay MacDonald, collapsed after less than a year. In the election held at the end of October, Mosley was put forward to run in the Ladywood constituency in Birmingham, something of a Chamberlain family stronghold that supported the Conservatives. Labour lost the wider national election by a large margin, primarily because the Liberal vote collapsed and shifted to the Conservatives. But in Ladywood, Mosley came very close to unseating Chamberlain, a future British Prime Minister. In fact, he may actually have done so. On the first count, Chamberlain was apparently elected by just 7 votes. Mosley understandably demanded a recount. On the second attempt, Mosley emerged as the victor by a margin of 2 votes. Eventually, on the final count, Chamberlain's vote seemed to suddenly increase by nearly 100 votes, and he won by a majority of 77. Mosley's political career was briefly on hold, though he had given Chamberlain such a scare that in the next election, he switched to the safer seat of Edgbaston. With his parliamentary career temporarily concluded, Mosley and Cynthia went traveling. In the 1920s, they visited various parts of Europe and the British Empire, notably India, where Cynthia had spent some of her earliest years when her father was viceroy there, and where the Curzons were well regarded. There, Mosley met with Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement. It is indicative of the contradictions that characterize Mosley that he could, despite displaying a clear streak of virulent anti-Semitism and racism in other respects in later years, demonstrate his respect for Gandhi after meeting him in the 1920s, while the Indian political leader, for his part, also stated that Mosley had made a favorable impression on him. Meanwhile, as he was out of Parliament in the mid-1920s, Mosley kept a close watch on developments at Westminster, and the Labour Party was eager to have a skilled orator representing them again in Parliament. Therefore, when the Smethwick seat in Staffordshire became vacant in 1926, Mosley was an obvious candidate to stand in his mother's native region. He won the campaign that December and thus, after a 2-year break, returned to Westminster. 2 years later, he would also ascend to the minor nobility as he succeeded as 6th Baronet Mosley upon the death of his father. Over the next several years, Mosley worked towards securing a senior position within the Labour's shadow cabinet, while the Conservatives governed for nearly a 5-year period following their earlier victory in the 1924 election. It was not until an election was held in May 1929, nicknamed the Flapper election, because it was the first British election in which women in their 20s were permitted to vote, that the political situation changed. Although the Wall Street crash would not occur for several months yet, the election took place against a backdrop of some early economic warning signs and rising unemployment in Britain, factors which saw Labour make extensive gains over the Conservatives and return Macdonald to 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister of a new minority government. Mosley had hoped for a senior cabinet appointment, but had to settle for the lesser position of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, an office focused on the administration of the royal estate. Macdonald did not wish to alienate a figure he viewed as full of promise and whom many in political circles in the 1920s saw as a potential leader of Labour and future Prime Minister. Hence, Macdonald assigned him some unofficial duties in addressing the unemployment problem, but Mosley was generally hindered in his efforts by more senior Labour Party veterans who had been involved in the party's economic policy formation for decades. The events of the late 1920s and early 1930s were to shape the course of the rest of Mosley's life. In the autumn of 1929, after half a decade of intense economic growth, as Europe rebuilt following the First World War and the civil wars that had ensued through 1923, the economy in Europe and the Americas became so overheated that it resulted in the Wall Street crash, one of the largest financial meltdowns in history. As is widely known, the Great Depression followed, a period of economic decline and stagnation that saw tens of millions of people lose their jobs and a level of deprivation among the poor in countries like Britain, Germany, and the United States unparalleled in modern times. The Great Depression also caused massive political upheaval in Europe and the Western Hemisphere, leading to the collapse of centrist governments. From 1930 onwards, political extremes on both the left and right were once again fashionable. For Mosley, the crisis of the Great Depression led him to again reconsider his political stances, as he concluded that the Labour Party lacked the capacity or the ideas to confront the economic crisis head-on. Having previously shown interest in the Conservatives and now the Labour movement, from 1930 onwards, he would forge his own political path. The first major indication of Mosley's increasingly independent inclination was seen in 1930 when he drafted and released what is now known as the Mosley Memorandum. The memorandum represented Mosley's blueprint for how Britain could extricate itself from the Great Depression. In it, he advocated for the implementation of high tariffs on imported goods from other European countries to protect British industry and commerce amidst the crisis, a measure he believed would increase employment domestically. Where goods needed to be sourced from abroad, he proposed they should come from parts of the British Empire rather than from the United States, Germany, France, or other competitors. He also called for the nationalization of certain British industries, a radical restructuring of the educational system to ensure British men and women remained in education longer and more people pursued higher education, while other aspects of the memorandum aimed at reducing the highly class-based nature of British society. Essentially, what Mosley was striving for was a state-led version of a knowledge economy with the objective of creating a broad and dynamic middle class. While Mosley is a highly controversial figure today, there is no denying that the memorandum contained appealing elements and was widely praised at the time by economists, including John Maynard Keynes, the most important economist of the first half of the 20th century. Over half a century later, policy analysts in the British Conservative Party reconsidered it as a potential response to the economic downturn of the early 1990s. Despite the praise the memorandum received from figures like Keynes at the time, it was clear to Mosley that it would not be accepted as the basis of the Labour Party's economic policy. He quickly decided to break away from the party. However, unlike Winston Churchill, whose family was somewhat close to the Mosleys, and who had once crossed the floor from the Conservatives to the Liberals, only to return to the Conservatives in the 1920s, Mosley would not rejoin the Tories, nor would he align with the Liberals, which were a rapidly declining force in British politics once support for the Labour Party expanded in the 1920s. Instead, Mosley formed his own party, naming it the New Party. Formally established in the spring of 1931, it immediately emerged as a minor parliamentary group as Mosley persuaded half a dozen fellow Labour MPs to join him. Its main policy platform was the Mosley Memorandum. Ultimately, the new party lasted for only a year, for in 1932, Mosley formed a new organization and integrated the new party into it. He called it the British Union of Fascists. Meanwhile, the new party lost its parliamentary representation swiftly as its main figures, including Mosley, lost their seats in the 1931 general election. It is worthwhile pausing in our account to consider the political landscape of Europe in the 1930s. The economic and social crisis brought about by the Great Depression, combined with fears of a communist takeover of much of Europe following the establishment of the Soviet Union near the end of the First World War, had created a general desire for a new political form in Europe, one that combined elements of radical nationalism and also elements of socialism. This peculiar blend of left and right-wing politics is typically identified as fascism today and is associated with extreme racial views, but contemporaries would have understood it more as a form of corporatism, the idea that a country's citizens would be unified in a corporate manner to further and advance their nation's cause in a way that was both nationalistic and socialistic, in the sense that the well-being of the middle and lower classes was to be prioritized as much as that of the upper classes. While it carries enormously sinister connotations today as a result of the barbaric racial elements incorporated into this fascist politics, when Mosley established the British Union of Fascists in 1932, those same negative overtones did not yet exist. Furthermore, what he was doing was entirely consistent with the general trend of politics in the Western world at that time. Nearly every country in Central Europe adopted some form of fascism or corporatism in the mid-1930s, as did Portugal and Spain, and even in countries where corporatist parties did not rise to power, such as in Ireland, there were still quasi-fascist movements during the 1930s that maintained significant links to the political establishment. As such, what Mosley was doing in the early to mid-1930s needs to be viewed in context. The period when Mosley was establishing the new party and then the British Union of Fascists in 1931 and 1932 were also years of continued infidelity in his marriage. The new object of his affections in the early 1930s was Diana Guinness, a scion of the Mitford family, a British aristocratic family. For his part, he had repeatedly stated his intention to leave Cynthia, though one suspects he might never have done so had fate not intervened in 1933 when Cynthia died at just 34 years of age from complications of peritonitis, which in turn had arisen following an operation for appendicitis. With this, Oswald and Diana were able to pursue their relationship more openly, and they soon emerged as the most prominent couple in the world of British fascism, with Diana faithfully espousing the political movement. Having come from a family keenly divided between adherents of fascism and socialism, it was not until 1936 that Oswald and Diana eventually married. They would have two sons, Alexander and Max. The British Union of Fascists experienced mixed success in the 1930s. Its membership grew to over 50,000 people, and it began to gain support from elements of the established British media, such as the Daily Mail newspaper, which once ran a headline proclaiming, "Hooray for the black shirts," in reference to the black shirt uniform Mosley had the members of the BUF adopt. It found particular success in certain areas of London and other urban centers where unemployment was high as a result of the Great Depression and where anti-migration sentiment was growing. However, it achieved very little electoral success, not contesting the 1935 general election and holding no more than a few seats on local councils at various points in the 1930s. This is how things largely remained throughout the decade. But while the BUF had no real parliamentary presence, they were still an unavoidable factor in British political life, with their distinctive uniforms, their rallies, and Mosley's oratory. Even those who politically reviled the BUF had to acknowledge that Oswald was perhaps the most effective political speaker in the country during the 1930s. If the BUF met with little electoral success in the 1930s, this was perhaps largely due to concerns about the party's connections to European fascism, and particularly with Nazi Germany. The Nazis, under Adolf Hitler, had come to power there in 1933. Much of their rhetoric focused on revitalizing Germany after the humiliation of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles that had been imposed on Germany in 1919. With their talk of Germany's re-emergence as the greatest power on the continent, many in Britain were uneasy about this new political experiment being orchestrated from Berlin and what implications it might hold for Britain and for peace in Europe. Despite the general unease with Hitler, Mosley actively cultivated closeness with the Nazis. When he and Diana were married in 1936, the ceremony was conducted in Germany at the home of the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. Mosley was also a great admirer of the Italian fascist leader, Benito Mussolini. In 1937, he initiated a project to establish a pro-German radio station broadcasting from the Channel Islands. It was all enough to make many in Britain question where Mosley's political loyalties lay and what his motives were concerning the BUF. Hand in hand with his growing ties to the fascist movements on the continent was the adoption of an increasingly xenophobic and anti-Semitic stance by Mosley and the BUF, particularly towards the Jewish community in Britain. There was also a more virulent form of anti-migration rhetoric in Mosley's political statements concerning groups such as the Irish and the peoples of the British Empire in regions like India and South Africa, a development that points towards a fundamental shift in his own political views from the more tolerant figure of the 1920s. The Metropolitan Police managed to prevent the event from escalating into major violence, with well over 100 people arrested. Overall, it demonstrated the growing racism of the BUF movement, but also the determination of many different groups in London to unite in opposing them. A petition to try to prevent the march gathered over 100,000 signatures, and the government subsequently moved to pass the Public Order Act of 1936, which prohibited large gatherings in which paramilitary uniforms like those of the black shirts would be worn. The late 1930s were an increasingly tumultuous period in the history of the BUF. On the continent, Germany was rapidly rearming in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, while in the spring of 1938 it infringed another major tenet of the 1919 peace treaty by entering a political union with Austria to create a Greater Germany. No sooner was this undertaken than Hitler began pressuring Britain, France, and Italy to permit him to annex the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia where a majority of people spoke German and identified as ethnically German. Eventually, the British and French yielded to pressure from Hitler at the Munich Conference of September 1938, but warned that any further acts of aggressive expansion would lead to war. As these events transpired, Mosley and the BUF became ever more controversial in England. At a rally in Liverpool late in 1937, members of the public pelted Mosley with rocks after he gave a fascist salute to the crowd, yet he continued to command a loyal following. At the Britain First rally held at Earl's Court Exhibition Hall on the 16th of July 1939, 30,000 people attended the largest indoor political rally in British history. There, Mosley inflamed the crowd with talk of how a Jewish conspiracy was driving Britain towards war with countries that should be its natural allies, and that the upcoming general election, scheduled for 1940, would be manipulated by Jewish financiers and those who controlled the media. It was a clear manifestation of the extent to which Mosley had embraced the ideological tenets of German Nazism. Even as Mosley was delivering his conspiracy-laden and anti-Semitic speech to his loyal base of followers at Earl's Court, Europe was descending into war. In March 1939, Hitler and the Nazis abandoned the promises made at Munich the previous autumn and annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia, simultaneously seizing the city of Memel from Lithuania. Their attention then turned to Poland. The Nazis initiated an aggressive campaign to convince Europe of Germany's rights to Polish territory. In August 1939, just weeks after Mosley's Britain First rally, a non-aggression pact was signed between Germany and its ideological adversary, the Soviet Union, clearing the way for the Nazis to invade Poland on the 1st of September after a false flag operation. As German tanks rolled over the eastern border, London and Paris declared war on Berlin. The Second World War remained largely a European conflict for months thereafter, with little major action. The Germans and Russians quickly overran Poland and partitioned it between them, but little occurred in the winter of 1939 and the spring of 1940, so much so that some began to refer to the war as a phony war. It was not until late spring that the next steps were taken, when Denmark and Norway were swiftly occupied by the Germans, and then the German Wehrmacht began amassing on the western border for the long-anticipated invasion of France. In Britain, Mosley's position was utterly compromised by these events. As the leader of the British fascist movement and someone who had openly acknowledged his ties to the regime in Berlin, he was now seen as the leader of a potential fifth column, a British equivalent of Vidkun Quisling, the former Norwegian Minister of Defense, who had formed a fascist party there in 1933. The National Samling, or National Gathering. Quisling had facilitated the Nazi occupation of Norway in April 1940 and later became the head of Nazi Norway. Mosley was perceived as a potential British version of Quisling. Yet there was also the possibility that he might be useful to the British government. There was no shortage of individuals in late 1939 and into 1940 in Britain, many within government circles, who believed Britain would be better off reaching an understanding with Hitler and the Nazis and uniting against the Soviet Union and other radical movements on the far left of the political spectrum. In advocating for a negotiated peace throughout the initial months of the war, Mosley was positioning himself as someone who could negotiate with Berlin on Britain's behalf if the situation shifted in favor of peace. Whatever aspirations Mosley might have held to become the architect of peace were dashed in just a few weeks in May 1940. Early that month, in response to a growing crisis over wartime leadership, Mosley's old rival from the 1924 general election, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was forced to resign as Prime Minister. He was succeeded by Winston Churchill, a figure who had consistently warned about the threat posed by the Nazis during the 1930s and who was committed to war with Germany. With this, Mosley's hopes of negotiating peace terms ended. Moreover, on the same day that Churchill assumed office, the 10th of May 1940, German army divisions invaded neutral Belgium and then advanced into northeastern France. The ensuing campaign was a disaster for the French and the British Expeditionary Force, the latter of which only narrowly avoided complete destruction at Dunkirk. With the fall of France and a potential German invasion of Britain on the horizon, the British government moved to secure its domestic position. In late May, Mosley was arrested and interned under Defense Regulation 18B. This emergency legislation had been enacted in September 1939 at the war's commencement to permit the arrest and detention of suspected enemies of the state during wartime without formal charge or trial. It was primarily employed in the subsequent years against members of the British Union of Fascists and those involved in the Irish nationalist movement in Northern Ireland who opposed the island's partition back in 1921. Mosley would be held for 3 years under Regulation 18B. The terms of Mosley's internment during the Second World War were not as severe as they might have been, largely due to the Prime Minister's intervention. Although their political views had diverged enormously during the 1930s to occupy the opposite extremes of the British political spectrum, Churchill had admired Mosley in the 1920s and considered him a figure of considerable promise. In 1940, he arranged for Mosley to be held under favorable conditions at Royal Holloway Prison. His wife Diana was also detained in the summer of 1940 after giving birth to their son Max. She was allowed to join Oswald, apparently as a result of Churchill's direct intervention. The reasons for this lay in the complex paternity of Churchill's wife Clementine. Clementine's mother Blanche had been known for her infidelity during her lifetime, and it was widely believed that Clementine's father was actually Algernon Bertram Freeman Mitford, Diana Mosley's grandfather. Diana's family reportedly appealed to Clementine and Churchill in 1940 to ensure Diana and Oswald were interned together. Meanwhile, their children from their first marriages and from their marriage to one another were cared for by several different family members during their period of detention. Oswald spent 3 years in prison. Neither he nor Diana was charged, for although they had come under very reasonable suspicion as the leading figures of British fascism, they had not technically committed any crime. By 1943, their detention had become something of a cause célèbre in British politics. This was related to the changing circumstances of the war. While Mosley had been arrested in the bleakest days of 1940, as France was on the verge of falling and the Battle of Britain loomed, the nature of the conflict had shifted dramatically from late 1941 onwards, as the German assault on the Soviet Union failed to deliver a decisive blow before the Russian winter arrived, and the United States entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. 1942 saw the Western Allies turn the tide in the North African campaign against the Italians and Germans, and in the summer of 1943, they opened a southern front in Italy. Meanwhile, the Battle of Stalingrad was won by the Russians in the autumn and winter of 1942. With these developments, the war's course had changed enormously in favor of the Allies, and any danger that Mosley and other British fascist leaders had posed was effectively neutralized. Consequently, after a significant debate in the House of Commons in early winter 1943, the Mosleys were released. They would, however, spend the remainder of the war under house arrest. Oswald and Diana spent the final year and a half of the war living with Mitford relatives and at the Shaven Crown Hotel in Oxfordshire. Their movements were restricted, and they remained under police surveillance, but they were reunited with their children and enjoyed a considerable degree of liberty. The press provided extensive coverage of their movements. This was also a period when news of the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million of Europe's Jews, and the mass killing of other groups such as the Romani and Sinti people by the Nazis began reaching Britain in the war's final months as camps were liberated across Europe. In these months and the years following the war, Mosley never expressed any regret for his involvement with the Nazis in the 1930s or for the anti-Semitism of the British Union of Fascists. Moreover, in subsequent years, he would become one of the leading voices in Britain, attempting to argue that the Holocaust had been exaggerated or that it had been orchestrated by rogue elements within the SS rather than having been directly ordered by Hitler and the other senior members of the Nazi regime. As such, while Mosley's politics moved on to other concerns in the post-war period, he never expressed any remorse for his role in the fascist politics of the 1930s and the genocidal programs that had resulted from it on the continent. With the war's conclusion in Europe in early summer 1945, Mosley was now free to resume his life without further penalty. One might have expected him to be content to live a private life, enjoying his family's extensive wealth and staying out of politics after spending half a decade in prison and under house arrest. Furthermore, his social standing after the war was not such as to warrant a political comeback. My Answer, in particular, sought to portray Mosley as a British patriot who had been unfairly criticized during the war years. His argument was that he could not have known what would transpire from 1939 onwards, and although it would have been poorly received in the mid-1940s, there had been many prominent political figures who had not been vehemently opposed to the Nazis in the 1930s, notably Britain's wartime leader during the First World War, David Lloyd George, and the former British monarch Edward IV. Having presented these arguments in his books, Mosley returned to politics in 1948 when he formed the Union movement. In many respects, the Union movement represented a return to his former politics. The party was undoubtedly positioned far to the right of the political spectrum. Its economic views were corporatist, and it continued the anti-Semitism of the interwar fascist movements, with Mosley attempting to exploit political opportunities arising from developments in the Levant, where the Zionist movement had become violently opposed to the British Mandate administration in the 2 years following the end of the Second World War. But where the Union movement diverged from Mosley's pre-war political ideology was in its promotion of pan-Europeanism. In his 1947 book, The Answer, Mosley outlined a theory that Europe had been moving inevitably towards a greater union for several centuries, beginning with the formation of large nation-states such as the United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, and Italy out of much smaller polities during the late medieval and early modern periods. Mosley's conclusion was that the establishment of a European supranational state, one that would unite countries like Britain, France, and Germany after centuries of conflict, was unavoidable. Such a state would operate based on a centralized European authority, with individual countries retaining significant degrees of autonomy but acting in concert on a wide range of issues, particularly economic policy. In this way, Mosley argued, the new movement, which he termed Europe a Nation, would be able to pursue its own relatively independent course without being dominated by either the United States or the Soviet Union in the emerging post-war Cold War order. Thus, very soon after the end of the Second World War, Mosley sought to rehabilitate himself as a major proponent of pan-Europeanism, or a form of European nationalism, as a substitute for the National Socialism and corporatism of the 1930s. There is no denying that what Mosley was advocating for in the post-war years closely mirrored the direction in which the European coal and steel community, then the European Economic Community, and finally the European Union would develop. Though Britain was slow to embrace involvement in the European project and remained a hesitant member for 4 decades before withdrawing in the late 2010s. Perhaps it was this British ambivalence to the growing pan-European movement that led to the Union movement's limited success, although it is much more likely that Mosley's very support would have made the British public even less inclined towards involvement with the inaugural ECSC in the 1950s. The British press had not forgotten the Mosley's wartime actions, and at the beginning of the 1950s, Oswald and Diana, along with their younger children, moved to Ireland, a country where anyone ostracized from the British political system was welcomed, regardless of the questionable path that had led to their disgrace. The Mosleys resided there for several years, an exile made more agreeable by the fact that several of Diana Mitford's siblings also had connections to Ireland. Deborah Mitford, for instance, had married into the Cavendish family, which possessed extensive estates in the southern part of the country. However much Mosley might have attempted to embrace a less controversial form of politics in the post-war years and sought a political comeback, his politics retained their racist edge. Two developments in the 1950s underscore this, the first related to Africa. In the aftermath of the war, Britain could not ignore demands for independence from many of its colonies. After India and Pakistan gained their independence in 1947, calls for the same escalated in Africa, where the British held lands covering much of southern Africa around modern-day Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Zambia, extensive territories further north around Uganda, Kenya, and Sudan, and other lands to the west in Nigeria and Ghana. Mosley's proposed solution to demands for independence was a form of continent-wide apartheid, whereby the European powers, Britain and France being the two nations controlling vast swathes of the continent, would divide their colonies into white and black controlled areas, largely replicating the system established in South Africa in the late 1940s to preserve the position of the white minority Afrikaner community there. Furthermore, he continued to hold business interests in South Africa throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. The second episode that revealed Mosley's racial views in the post-war period occurred in Britain itself in the late 1950s. By the mid-1950s, the increasing influx of people from overseas into London and England more broadly was generating growing inter-community tension in some areas of England's major cities, particularly during periods of low employment when native-born English people perceived the newcomers as taking jobs they might otherwise have obtained. This led in the autumn of 1958 to the Notting Hill race riots in the Notting Hill area of London. A week of violence saw attacks on people of West Indian descent and numerous arrests. Mosley's reaction was to return to England and run for election in the Kensington district of London in 1959, structuring his campaign around exploiting racial tensions in the capital. Some of the proposals he put forward during the campaign were extremely regressive, not only favoring a ban on further migration from the empire or what remained of it, but also proposing forced deportations of those who had arrived in the decade or so after the war and a prohibition on intermarriage. It was the closest he would come to a major political breakthrough in the post-war years, capturing nearly 10% of the vote, though ultimately failing to win a seat. Following his unsuccessful election bid in 1959, Mosley relocated with Diana to Paris. For the most part, they spent the rest of their lives in Orsay, an affluent suburb on the outskirts of the city. From here, he began efforts to coordinate with other pan-European, far-right political movements in other countries. This led in the 1960s to the formation of the National Party of Europe, an umbrella organization that included Mosley's Union movement in Britain, the Deutsche Reichspartei in West Germany, the Italian Social Movement, and Jeune Europe in Belgium, all far-right parties with neo-fascist elements in their operations. A manifesto released in 1962 foreshadowed many features of what would become the European Union, calling for a European Parliament and other similar federal measures. But others echoed the corporatist politics of the right in the 1930s by declaring the movement's antipathy towards both communism and capitalism. Essentially, it advocated for a third way, whereby Europe would separate itself from both the US and the USSR, while another proposal was for the dismantling of the United Nations and its replacement with a tripartite body composed of the US, the USSR, and the new European supranational state. A final novel element was the description of parts of Africa as constituting part of Europe, clearly a provision designed to keep the Maghreb under European control to generate support for the movement in France, as that country was still engaged in war attempting to retain control over Algeria. The National Party of Europe achieved very little success in the 1960s or 1970s, although its policy platform is curious in retrospect. for offering an alternative vision of pan-Europeanism at a time when the founding members of the European coal and steel community were only beginning to contemplate the idea of a more formal union among their countries. Interestingly, while the far right has generally become opposed to European federalism in the intervening decades, in the 1960s, far-right parties favored federalism, though of a kind that sought to curb migration from overseas and implied a territorial claim over North Africa. Meeting with little success in this initiative, Mosley began writing an autobiography in the latter half of the 1960s, one that would build upon the political defense he had first provided in My Answer back in 1946. My Life was published in 1968. It was hardly an attempt to seek redemption for his past political life, but rather sought to explain away certain criticisms that had been leveled against him over the years, with Mosley being unrepentant in his view that Europe should be a continent for Europeans and claiming that his politics in the 1930s were a response to the ineffectiveness of both labor and the conservatives. By the time My Life was published in 1968, Mosley had entered his 70s. His health was gradually declining. He had made one final effort to gain election in Britain in 1966, and after another humiliating defeat in which he received less than 5% of the vote, he effectively resigned himself to the end of his political career. The Union movement was dissolved in the early 1970s and was superseded by the National Front as the main far-right party in Britain. By the time it began to gain some popularity in Britain in the mid-1970s as the UK entered the worst economic crisis it had seen since the Great Depression, Mosley was suffering from Parkinson's disease in France. His final years were largely spent uninvolved in active politics due to poor health and old age. He died in Orsay on the 3rd of December 1980 at the age of 84. A small funeral was held in Paris, after which Oswald was cremated, and his remains were scattered around the famous Père Lachaise cemetery. Just over 2 years later, his eldest son, Nicholas, born in 1923 from his first marriage to Cynthia, published a 2-volume biography of his father and the Mosley's family life. Oswald had requested Nicholas, with whom he had a difficult relationship, to write it, providing full access to his private papers to enable him to do so. The work was generally critical of Oswald and his political career, while humanizing him as a father. Oswald Mosley was a complex individual. It would be easy today to dismiss him simply as a potential fascist dictator of Britain, and admittedly, his politics contained many such elements. Yet his political views in the 1930s should not be interpreted solely in light of what the Nazis did across Europe in the late 1930s and the first half of the 1940s. There were different forms of corporatism and fascism, such as Franco's regime in Spain. Similarly, Mosley's brand of corporatism differed from what was being advocated in Germany. Moreover, his economic policies were endorsed by a broad cross-section of leading British economists during the Great Depression, while his post-Second World War pan-Europeanism foreshadowed the general political direction. What is your perspective on Oswald Mosley? Should he be regarded as a straightforward fifth column of the Nazi movement within Britain, or was he a more complex figure?